My apologies again, folks. We are having our struggles with new software, and it's taking a bit longer than we thought it would have to. We appreciate your patience enormously. Let me remind us where we are. We've had a question from Daniel Pinsky. It has to do with worker co ops and unions. Can unions in some way change into co ops, and that be a way to get beyond capitalism in our society? And I was going through some examples of relationships and alliances and coalitions that already exist and have existed historically between labor unions and worker co ops. And I just before the cutoff was going to give you a website where you can go and learn all about this because there is enough of this going on that there are two institutions I would refer you to. One is called the United States Federation of Worker Co-ops because they have a union co-op council designed to deal with these relationships and are in a practical way answering Daniel Pinsky's question. And there's another website I would suggest you go and try, unioncoops.org. Union co-ops, all one word, .org, and you will get more examples and more information. To conclude, I'd like to tell you a story. It's an amalgam of experiences I have had and others like me have had, which goes directly to the question Daniel Pinsky asked. Imagine a union negotiating with an employer and reaching, which happens often, an impasse. And in that impasse, the employer makes what he believes is the ultimate threat. If you, the union, do not accept whatever wages and working conditions I offer, I will have no choice but to close the enterprise. And then you'll have no job and no income at all. It's a very serious threat. It puts the union in an extremely difficult position. Do you want to call this if you think it's a bluff? Because look what might happen if it isn't. But now enter the worker co-op, and in the following way, the union gets together and surprises the employer and says to the employer, you're threatening us. And even if we submit to your threat, we will never know when you'll use this threat against us again and again. We let you get away with it once, we incentivize you to do it again. We'll have no job security. We'll have no security even in the wages we win because you're going to threaten us again next time. So we're going to surprise you, Mr. Employer. You threaten to close the business? Go ahead. We welcome you. Leave. Now watch the logic here. The employer, not bluffing this time maybe, closes the factory, closes the store, closes the office. The workers and their union now come back and say, wait a minute, you're gone, but the jobs don't have to go, and the business doesn't have to go, and the taxes it pays to the local community don't have to go, and the support it gives to surrounding businesses in this area, in this neighborhood, none of them have to suffer. Because we, here we go, are going to convert this business into a worker co-op. Now, the leaders of this union, if their workers together have made the decision to go this route, now approach the local politicians, the mayor, the congressperson, the senator, the governor, and they say to these politicians, this company is closing or threatening us with closing. And if they do, there'll be job loss, there'll be income loss, there'll be tax revenue loss to the communities, and so on. And we're here to tell you, mayor, governor, whatever, if you work with us to keep this business going as a worker co-op, which we're going to take over, we will help you, and we'll help you the way you help us. We need some subsidies to get us through the transition. We need some tax holidays to get us through the transition. You know, we need what you have often given to capitalist enterprises. You better give that to us too. And if you do, here's what we'll do for you. We'll go around this district here and say, you saved the jobs, you saved the business, you were the help that this community needed when that company took off. And the unwritten message of the conversation, if you don't help us, politician A, B, C, or D, you'll be lucky to be elected dog catcher around here next time. It's a whole new world, folks. So my answer to Daniel Pinsky is, yeah, unions can be the way to become worker co-ops, and they can do it to give them a new weapon beyond job action, beyond the strike. There's the conversion to a worker co-op that can also be brought into the equation. And believe me, many an employer will agree to something they might not have if what they see coming down the pike is a worker co-op, and then they have no business at all. It's a ratcheting up of the class struggle, and worker co-ops can play that role as an ally, as an adjunct, as a new and powerful weapon to advance the interests of the worker majority against the employer minority. The second question that came in that I want to respond to before opening it up comes from Doug Morris. And Doug says, you know, back a century ago, the IWW and other working class organizations agitated for the 4-day work week or the 4-hour work day, or maybe even for both of them. And they argued that that was necessary for workers to have relaxation, for workers to have a balance between work life and home life, for workers to indulge their interest in music, in art, and relationships with other people, and so on. Where is that today? Where is this liberation of people to have free time that is so precious in a lifetime, to develop their own creativities? Doug Morris is quite eloquent in his question. I don't have the time to repeat it. So I want to tell you that this is not dead. And I want sadly to tell you that if you are a citizen of the United States, one of the reasons you ask this question is because you're not familiar with struggles for the 4-day work week. And I'm going to focus on that one. Maybe at a subsequent time, we can talk about the 4-hour work day. But we'll start today with the 4-day work week. If you're an American, you don't know much about it because not much is talked about here. So I'm going to draw examples from other parts of the world, but there's nothing about any of them that couldn't or shouldn't be happening in the United States. I'll start with Belgium, small country in Europe. Last year, the parliament in Belgium passed a law, and here's what the law says. Any worker in Belgium, any employee who approaches his or her or their employer with the following proposition: I am interested in doing the work that I do for you now, but not in 5 days, only in 4. Here's the law now in Belgium. No employer can refuse to do that, period. It's possible in Belgium. Let's not imagine that it isn't possible elsewhere. I'm going to give you some more examples. In Portugal, the government funded an experiment with 39 companies giving their workers 4-day-a-week jobs. Moreover, in Portugal, they specified the workers will continue to get 100% of their pay, but they'll only be required to do 80% of the work week, 1 day off. According to the results of this experiment over the last 2 or 3 years, it has been fully successful. That's what they called it. In the United Kingdom, Great Britain, 61 companies with 3,300 employees undertook a study. It was managed by professors at Oxford, Cambridge, and at Boston College here in the United States. And they found it was, again, extremely successful. 92% of the companies kept the 4-day work week even after the experiment was over. That's how happy they were with the results. Spain has been conducting an experiment like this. Iceland had an experiment like this, all of them very successful. If I had more time, I'd give you more, but I think the point is made. Now, let me drive it home in another way. Polls here in the United States and Canada show that the majority of workers here would prefer a 4-day week, but we don't have one, and we don't have anything like the law in Belgium. We could, but we don't. But it's actually worse than that. Neither Mr. Trump, the leading Republican candidate for president, nor Mr. Biden, the leading Democrat candidate for president, has said a word about this. They don't bring it up. They don't discuss it. They don't take a position for or against it. They pretend, like the mass media in America, that there's no issue there, that what is happening in other parts of the world doesn't matter. What the polls in the United States show is the desire of an overwhelming majority of the working class doesn't matter either. These experiments that have been done show that workers are more productive if they have 4 days work week, not 5 days. So the argument that it will be less productive makes no sense. Here's another statistic just to add. Of all the countries in Europe over the last 30 to 40 years, one is the powerhouse success economy of the whole continent. And everybody knows who that is. It's Germany. Germany. And what's interesting about Germany is not that it's had the greatest success, the greatest rate of growth, the highest standard of living, and all the rest. Here's the reality. The average work week in Germany is 34.2 hours, not 40 hours. 34.2. That's almost 1 day off a week, per week. It's almost like they've had it already. And they're among the most productive economies in Europe, and they have been for a long time. So the notion that somehow the economy is threatened if you have a shorter work week, it's wrong. It's been shown wrong. It's been proven wrong over and over and over again. Only in the United States and Canada do we have a political class and the media that work with them to keep it off the radar, so there isn't a conversation. When we have new technology, which we boast, we don't use it to liberate people from the drudgery of work. We use it to make more profits for a minority, the minority that own the shares. Remember, 10% of our richest people own 80% of the shares in the stock market. We use technology for profit, not to enable people to have the rich, diverse life. It's a tragedy for the American working class. But more and more, what that working class has to learn is that the old boast that we here in the United States have it better than anyone else, that's not true. Hasn't been true for a while. And the reality of it is crowding itself in onto the consciousness of the United States. And this conversation about a 4-day work week is proof. And one last point before I open it up to your questions live right now. The pandemic showed the working classes of all countries that they could organize the work they have to do on their own schedule, at home, where they had to be anyway because of the pandemic. They could get their work done, and they could do it when it was good for them in their life, with their household, their children, their elderly, their circumstances. And they don't want to go back to that 5-day-a-week grind, do they? We see it everywhere. That's more evidence this is not working for the working class, the 5-day week. And they're the majority, aren't they? And you don't have to lose output because we have the proof that the productivity goes up. And you know why? Because workers are happier and better in that situation than they are now. And that's a recipe for real social change. Okay, enough with the questions that came before. My assistant is putting up the first of your questions, but unfortunately it's upside down and I can't read it. So please correct it so I can respond to those in our audience. Wonderful. A little lower and then I'll be able to do it. Perfect. Can you explain why the United States GDP is still reported to be higher than any other country, despite the fact that the US doesn't have industries producing the number of goods it once did? Yes, there's a difference between goods being produced on the one hand and gross domestic product, which is what GDP means on the other. The GDP is a statistic, that's all it is. It measures the total output of goods and services that the government keeps track of. So, for example, in the GDP, we keep track of what is done in the corner store, in the factory, in the office. But it's not just goods being produced. It's all those other things, paper being moved around an office. The worth of that is calculated. By the way, if you're interested, there are numbers that are not counted in the GDP. For example, all of the goods and services produced in the household. Inside the household, labor is done, right? We take a raw food and we cook it into a finished meal. We take dirty laundry and we clean it to make fresh and clean laundry. That's work. That's output. Here's a joke that used to be made in economics classes when I was a student. If a housewife, because we make housework something peculiarly assigned to women instead of equally distributed, if a housewife works hard at home, we don't count the GDP. The wealth of this country doesn't count that. If that woman quits and takes a job doing the same tasks in some business, it gets counted. The GDP goes up, not because we're producing more, but because the woman has gone from a place of production that is counted to a place of production, from a place of production that isn't counted to a place of production that is. So GDPs can vary for all kinds of reasons that have little or nothing to do with goods actually produced. Having said that, let me be clear with you. The United States is no longer the major producer of goods, as your question recognizes, but the United States is at the last stages of being the number one GDP producer, because there is another country that is catching up. By certain measures, it already has caught up, and that is the People's Republic of China. So, right question, right on what's happening in terms of the history of different economies in the world. And the reality is that the United States simply is shrinking in terms of its economic footprint in the world compared to other parts of the world. That's been going on for quite a while, and there is no indication it's not going to continue. I might give you as a final example, the current estimate of the rise of the GDP, gross domestic product, as it's counted in the United States, we expect about a 2% increase in 2023. In the People's Republic of China, the current expectation by both domestic and international statistical agencies is for a growth in the neighborhood of 5.5%. That, then it's simply a matter of time before the Chinese outgrow the United States, continuing what's been going on for the last 25 to 30 years in any case. Good, we've perfected this new system, or at least we're getting there. Here's the next question that comes from you, our live audience. Can you tell us exactly what the World Economic Forum is and does? Well, you know, the World Economic Forum is one of those collections. There are now dozens of them in which varying groups of the world's major, and sometimes not even only major, but minor nations, economically speaking, get together and talk about the problems that they have. Some are more famous, some are less. Some are grouping only the biggest countries. For example, the G7. That's the United States and Canada and Japan and Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Okay, those seven, those are the West sometimes. They are the industrial countries and so forth. The next big one that you hear about, more often than you hear about the World Economic Forum, are the BRICS. There, the acronym stands for Britain, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And a few months ago, they added another 6 countries that applied for membership. So the BRICS is now a group of 11 rather than the United States and its major allies, the G7, and they have their own meetings. And then in places like the World Forum, they gather an even larger group, including these others, and many other forums like that. Some are specialized and looking at particular issues like climate change or trade or competition or nowadays more geopolitical warfare, wars that are disrupting things. A pandemic would be an object of discussion and so forth. AI, artificial intelligence, and what its implications are. But other than that, they are mostly occasions where leading politicians, sometimes that's all, sometimes leading politicians and big business leaders, bankers, and major corporations get together and talk about problems. The businesses usually looking to advance their business interests, and the politicians and political leaders usually busy talking to their back home populations who read about what they say at the great conference. In short, these are meetings where much more heat than light, much more self-promotion than serious engagement with issues. If there is serious work to be done, and it is done at places like the World Economic Forum, it's out of the public eye. It's in the rooms where politicians and diplomats meet, away from journalists, away from the public eye, so they can deal with problems in a way they would not dare to if their own populations could witness what they are doing. Do you think, next question that comes, and by the way, let me thank you for being here, for doing this with us, for thinking about these issues, for posing these questions. That's exactly what we were hoping for as your participation and why we do this. So here's the next question, live from you. Do you think the increase in union activity is related to the tightening or strain on the money supply? If there is a link, if there is a relationship, it's indirect. You know, you don't have a rising labor militancy of the sort we're seeing in this country. And look, let's be real clear. The Teamsters with UPS, the United Auto Workers with the car companies right now, the folks out in California and the West Coast in the Kaiser Permanente situation, and countless other examples I could give, show that working class people are on the move. They're forming unions where they don't exist. They're striking for better contracts. They're getting better contracts. Is it enough? Is it what they deserve? I don't think so, but that's really a second question. The union activity like this, when millions of workers are doing things and joining picket lines and passing petitions in a way they have not done for decades in the United States, is unmistakable. But how much is it related to the money supply? Again, not much and not very directly. Workers do not take the risks. And let me remind everyone, it's a risk to go on strike. Even if you win, you have to count your winnings against the cost of not having a paycheck for the number of days or weeks you're out. It's a risk that people around you who aren't yet ready to fight for what they need will try to take out their ambivalence about being active themselves by somehow bad mouthing your activity. You're going to have the mass media, which in this country are all organized as huge corporations, tilting towards the employers because they're run by employers who are sympathetic with other employers and don't want to see labor militancy, especially if it might come to their particular businesses in the mass media. So you've got some formidable obstacles, and workers need to have been oppressed by a lot of things to push them to become active. And those are all much more important than the money supply. Let me give you an example or two. The last 4 or 5 years have been excruciating for the American working class. We have had 3 economic crashes so far in this new young century. The dot-com crisis of 2000, the so-called Great Recession of 2008 and 9, and finally the so-called COVID-19 crisis of 2020, 2021. You put all these things together, and you have subjected the working class to tremendous blows of unemployment and of upset and of loss of jobs and so on. And on top of that, you've had a really bad inflation in the last 2 or 3 years. And on top of that, we now have interest rates rising. This morning's newspaper carried the information that for a 30-year mortgage to buy a home, that's one of the most common ways people get a home, now will cost you over 8% per year. It means that the vast majority of Americans cannot afford a home. One of the so-called basic things about the so-called American dream was home ownership. Well, it's now out of reach of the overwhelming majority of our people, and there's no end in sight. These are all blows to the working class, to its standard of living, to what it hopes for itself, to what it hopes for its children. And that's why workers are on strike. And that's why workers are joining a union. They need it. They know they need it. And they know that the political system isn't helping them and that their employer is just looking to make an extra buck. They understand if they don't get together and rely on one another, which is what union literally means, they're not going to have much of a chance in what's happening in this country at this time. That's why they're doing it. In that story, yeah, the money supply, because it may drive down interest rates for a while, may play some role. Pumping money into the economy may lead businesses to borrow more and maybe use it to hire workers. So it'll have some impact here or there. But on the other hand, when money is pulled back by the monetary authorities, in this country, the Federal Reserve, it's part of why interest rates go up. And when interest rates go up, workers lose their jobs because companies can't afford to pay that interest. We're seeing a collapse of our housing industry because it doesn't pay to build a house because nobody can borrow at 8% to buy the house if you build it. So you put it all together. We do have militancy, but we have it for deep-seated, long maturing reasons. And manipulating the money supply this way or that isn't going to be a big fix because the cause of labor militancy runs deeper and has a long way yet to go. Do we have another question? Good. Here comes one. What, if anything, does Marx say about how free speech fits into a socialist Marxian society? Well, Marx, when he wrote at his time, was a fierce advocate of free speech. Why? Because Marx, throughout his life, lived in a capitalist society about which he was critical. He was a critic of capitalism. Literally everything Marx wrote was critical. There were no socialist societies during the time Marx lived, with the exception of a few months in the year 1871, when the people of Paris arose, took the city of Paris away from the people who ran it, and established something that has ever since been called the Paris Commune. It's a wonderful story. Marx was very involved, even though he was living in London, England at the time, but that's not all that far from Paris. His agents, his people, his friends, his associates were active in the Paris Commune. But other than those few months, Marx's life could not be about how you organize a socialist society, because there were none. They were building a movement that might take society beyond the capitalism, but they weren't there yet. Those of you know the first country that becomes, in some sense, socialist, refers to itself as embodying Marx's ideas, was Russia. And that didn't happen until 1917, whereas Marx died in 1883, literally 40 years before the revolution, roughly speaking. So in this situation, Marx was an advocate of free speech, because he wanted to be free as a critic to do so. And also he had a personal reason for advocating freedom of expression, freedom of speaking, of writing. Because when he tried to do that in his native Germany, the government came down on him like a ton of bricks. In those years, the way a country got rid of its critics, if it couldn't open itself up to them, was not murdering these people and not even imprisoning them most of the time. The preferred method of dealing, which Marx himself suffered, was exile. So when the Germans, and Marx was still a young man at this time, when the German government didn't want him anymore, they put him on a train that left Berlin and went to Paris. It's a few-hour train ride, but they also informed the French police, so that when Marx got to the train station in Paris, the French police were there to inform him he couldn't stay there either, and they were immediately exiling him to Belgium, to Brussels. So his stay in Paris was counted in hours. And the same thing happened when he got to Brussels, and they put him on a train and a boat to go to London. London in those years, the middle of the 19th century, was a place that prided itself on freedom of speech. And so they allowed refugees like Marx, coming from continental Europe, to stay in London, where they could enjoy, relative to what they had had before, the freedom to speak. And Marx was very appreciative. One of the reasons he stayed in Great Britain for the rest of his life, Marx is buried in London, he stayed there because they had the freedom of speech, which he very much supported. If your question is motivated by the fact, would Marx support freedom of speech in a place like the People's Republic of China or North Korea or Vietnam or Cuba or other places that now refer to themselves as socialist societies, I'm sure his answer would be yes. His support for freedom of speech was not conditional in the way you might have imagined. And I think there are many Marxists in places that I just mentioned, in those countries, who are critical that there isn't more freedom of speech in those societies. Here's another question coming in, one of the biggest counter arguments to co-ops is whether or not the individual who put in the work to start a business deserves greater control over the fate of the organization. Can this be explained in regards to fairness? I think it can. And I'm sympathetic to saying that there's something unique about a person who has whatever it takes to start a business. And I think that uniqueness, that extra effort, if you like, that creativity, that deserves to be recognized and to be applauded in a society. I'm fine with all of that. But fairness is something else. Fairness is always comparative. Fair in relationship to what? I want to recognize the literal beginner of a business, the creator. Give that person a reward. Give that person extra financial support. I'm open to all of those. But give that person the right, for example, to hire and fire other people? No, I don't think that's fair at all. Any more than the employee should have the right to fire the employer. If you're going to set up a system in which you're going to talk about fairness. Everybody's future depends on how that enterprise works. Everybody who works there depends on how it works. Everybody who works there is taking a risk. The person who started it risked his or her or their time, their money, their energy. But the people who come to work in that enterprise, 6 months later, a year later, 2 years, 5, they're risking too. They left wherever they lived before to come here and get a job. They risked that the owner makes a mistake in his investment strategy and the business goes belly up, in which case they lose their job. They lose their income. They cannot meet their mortgage payments. Everybody in an enterprise takes risks. And it's only fair that if everybody is at risk, everybody gets a chance to share in making the decisions. If they together make a decision and it goes bad, okay, they all had their input, they all had their chance, they all could argue, and now they have to live with the results. But that's not how capitalism works. It says if you start the business, you're going to get, in most cases, to own it and to run it. You will decide what investments are made or not made. You will decide what technology is used or not used. You will decide what portion of the profits everybody helps to make will be used for better machinery or for better working conditions. You make all the decisions, but all your workers are at risk that the decisions you make are either bad for the business or maybe good for that individual leader, but not for the mass of the workers. And none of that's fair. So I ask you, I kind of turn the question around. It's fair to say that anyone who brings something unique to an enterprise deserves to have that recognized and to have that appreciated. Starting a business is a unique thing to be able to do. But having certain kinds of skills is the same. And I don't just mean skills working a machine or skills designing software. I mean also the skills of how to get groups of people to work better together, how to teach them to talk to each other, to communicate so that they can understand and support one another. That's an incredible skill. Different workers bring different skills. Fairness requires recognizing all of them, not just imagining that it's the beginner who has the great uniqueness. Yes, it's part of the story. No, it's not the end. And because you did something to start a business doesn't mean that 10, 20, or 30 years later, you are somehow still cashing in on what you did. And not at all is that acceptable if it's at the expense of all the other people that are working with you, committing to you, and all the rest. All right, folks, I believe we have time for one more in today's session. Do we have that? No. I am told by my colleagues here that we don't. Let me again thank you for your questions. I'm going to work with my team here to get rid of the kinks that we encountered this time, the interruption that we suffered. We will do everything we can. Please remember, we're working hard. We'll be here next week. And I want to thank you once again and look forward to doing this a week from today with all of you again. Thank you.